A quiet street in an Argentinian coastal resort. Nothing out of the ordinary. But early in 1998, the peaceful atmosphere is suddenly shattered as the world's press descends on the home of a 77-year-old Croatian called Dinko Sakic.
Asesino! Asesino!
An Argentinian police car takes Dinko Sakic on the first leg of a journey that will end in a courtroom back in his homeland, 6,000 miles away. The crimes for which Sakic now faces trial were committed more than half a century earlier, during World War II. At the time, Croatia was an ally of the Nazis, and its leader, Ante Pavelic, modeled himself on Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. As the war unfolded, Croatia was sucked into collaboration. And Dinko Sakic ended up as the commandant of one of the most notorious death camps of World War II, Jasenovac. Jasenovac became known as the Auschwitz of the Balkans. Here, Sakic carried out acts of torture and mass murder in the name of the Croatian people. Now, after more than 50 years on the run, justice has finally caught up with Dinko Sakic. But in his homeland, his case raised old and deep divisions. Dinko Sakic may be the man facing trial, but the horrifying deeds that he stands accused of cast a stain not only on the newly created country of Croatia, but also on the Roman Catholic Church. Can collaborating with the Nazis ever be justified in the name of freedom? And was Dinko Sakic an honorable freedom fighter or a sadistic war criminal?
Mire, no hablo lo que era antes ni lo que era después, pero mientras yo estaba nadie podía tocar. Nadie podía tocar a nadie.
November 1918, the end of World War I, and just 3 years before the birth of Dinko Sakic. Victorious Serbian troops make their way back to their capital, Belgrade. King Alexander of Serbia becomes the head of a new kingdom created out of the ruins of war. But it's a kingdom that is both complex and turbulent. As well as his own people, the Serbs, he was ruling over the Croats, the people of Slovenia, Bosnians, Kosovo Albanians, the people of Macedonia, and Montenegro. These people had different religions, different histories, different cultures, and even different languages. It was a dangerous and volatile mixture. King Alexander had to rule these disparate lands with a firm hand. He suppressed regional loyalties. Politicians hostile to the monarchy were sidelined, sometimes even imprisoned. In 1929, Alexander gave a new name to his kingdom. He called it Yugoslavia, the land of the southern Slavs. He then cracked down hard on political parties who opposed him, including a rising Croat nationalist called Ante Pavelic. Pavelic's brand of fiery nationalism places him in the forefront of Croatian politics. But Alexander's crackdown now forced him and his followers to flee to neighboring Italy.
Deve cristallizzare una posizione di potente ingiustizia, perché ha dato la fiamma il sangue.
Italy's leader was Benito Mussolini, then at the height of his power and popularity.
La vittoria è per noi, per I primi.
Mussolini formed his fascist party after World War I by exploiting the grievances of soldiers returning from the front, only to find mass unemployment. He organized them into armed squads known as the Black Shirts, who terrorized their political opponents. In 1922, Mussolini became Prime Minister of Italy. By the end of the decade, he had become dictator and set about re-establishing his country as a great European power. Mussolini suspended civil liberties and destroyed all opposition, all tactics that appealed to Pavelić. In 1935, he invaded Ethiopia and absorbed it into what he referred to as his new Italian Empire. He also provided military support to General Franco in the Spanish Civil War. Later, influenced by Adolf Hitler, Mussolini began to introduce anti-Jewish legislation into Italy. This was the perfect environment for Ante Pavelić to establish his own fascist movement. He called it the Ustaša. The word in Serbo-Croat means insurgent. For his part, Mussolini saw the Ustaša movement as a means to break up the Kingdom of Yugoslavia and to expand Italian influence in the Balkans. He placed money and weapons at Pavelić's disposal. Then, in October 1934, the Ustaša made their move. A hit squad was organized to attack their enemy, King Alexander. But they'd have to wait for their opportunity. It came when Alexander went to Marseille in the south of France on a state visit. The king and his French guests were greeted by the people of the city, completely unaware that fascist terrorists had infiltrated the crowd.
The body of Alexander of Yugoslavia is to be borne through the city streets. The grief-stricken Queen Maria walks with her little son, King Peter. Behind them come notabilities of every country in Europe.
Yugoslavia had lost its strongman. Alexander's heir, Peter, was just a boy, too young and too weak to unite a country. For his involvement in Alexander's assassination, a French court sentenced Pavelić to death in his absence. But safe under Mussolini's protection, Pavelić and the Ustaša movement continued to thrive.
Und wir müssen fest zusammenstehen für dieses Deutschland. Sieg heil!
By now, Ante Pavelić had another potential ally, Adolf Hitler, the dictator of Nazi Germany. In the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini came together to form what became known as the Pact of Steel. Their alliance gave great hope to right-wing nationalists throughout Europe. Pavelić believed Italian fascism and German Nazism to be the wave of the future, and the means by which Croatia would regain its freedom. His dream was of an independent Croatian state entirely free of foreigners like Serbs and Jews. It was extraordinarily attractive to many Croats, especially to a young man like Dinko Sakic. Fired up by Croatian nationalist zeal, Sakic was ready for action. It wasn't long in coming. On April the 8th, 1941, war came to Yugoslavia. In the previous 18 months, Nazi Germany had conquered Poland, most of Scandinavia, and the whole of Western Europe. Now, it was Yugoslavia's turn. The Yugoslav army quickly collapsed, and in just 11 days the fighting was over, and the Yugoslav monarchy fled.
Hier werden unsere Soldaten mit jubelnder Begeisterung als Befreier begrüßt.
But in some parts of Yugoslavia, German troops were greeted as liberators. The arrival of German and Italian soldiers now allowed the underground Ustasha movement to seize power in the Croat capital, Zagreb.
The local population, Croats, I would say, many of them were happy when this state of Yugoslavia collapsed, because they were not happy in that semi-democratic regime, terror, repression. People were thinking that the war is over. But it was, of course, it wasn't. The catastrophe, the tragedy, then started.
Pavelić returned from his exile in Italy and declared an independent Croat state. Backed by fascist Italy and Nazi Germany, Pavelic's new state consisted not only of traditionally Croat lands, but the whole of Bosnia. A substantial Serb minority now found itself living under Ustasha rule.
Martial law was introduced the second day, racial laws only after 15 days. First, anti-Serbian measures also in the first days. Mass killings took place already at the beginning of May. That means 20 days after the creation of the government. They were very, very, very fast.
But there was one major difference between Pavelic's brand of fascism and that of the Nazis. Whereas the Nazis largely despised religion, Pavelic's regime was staunchly Roman Catholic. And Pavelić wanted to create an exclusively Catholic state and cleanse his native land of all alien elements.
They had this strategy of the thirds. That means 1/3 of the Serbs should be killed, 1/3 of the Serbs should be sent to Serbia, and 1/3 should become Catholics. And if they become Catholics, then they become Croats, and that's how he thought that he will resolve so-called solution of the Serbian question.
In one of the blacker moments of the Catholic Church's 20th century history, the country's leading cleric, Archbishop Stepinac, gave the regime his blessing. Much of the Catholic Church became an active partner in the forced conversion of the traditionally Christian Orthodox Serbs to Catholicism. Croat fascism and the Catholic Church would remain uncomfortably entwined for the rest of the war.
The position of the Catholic Church in the Second World War is, of course, full of controversies. When the first Ustasha crimes happened and they saw what was going on, the Church was never united in the attitude. Some of them cooperated with Ustasha, and some of them even committed crimes.
Pavelić now unleashed a reign of terror on the Serb minority living within Croatia. Tens of thousands of them were expelled, killed, or imprisoned. Anti-fascist Croats were also jailed. Bowing to German wishes, the Ustasha targeted gypsies and Jews as well. Their persecution of the Jews became an excuse for organized theft on a massive scale. As they were rounded up, Jews were stripped of all their possessions, down to the wedding rings on their fingers. By July 1941, the country's prisons could no longer cope with the flood of new inmates. That summer, the Ustasha embarked on the construction of what would become some of the biggest and most horrific concentration camps in Europe. Dinko Sakic, now 21, seized his moment to join the cause and signed up to be a camp guard. Over the next few years, he would rise through the ranks to become what many allege was one of the most brutal, if little known, Nazi collaborators of World War II. Sakic's first job was at Jasenovac, just an hour's drive from the capital, Zagreb. At Jasenovac, a number of separate camps were built on the banks of the Sava River. The complex housed the largest number of prison inmates in the whole of Croatia. Today at the Jasenovac site, memorials and sculptures stand as a reminder of those that suffered and died here. The mastermind behind the camp was Max Luburic, head of Pavelić's newly formed special police force and overall commander of the Ustasha's concentration camp program. In 1943, Dinko Sakic married Max Luburic's half-sister Nada, a guard at one of the women's camps at Jasenovac. It was a move that secured a place in Luburic's inner circle. Then, at the age of 24, Sakic was appointed camp commandant.
Luburic was a very important person, and he, of course, wanted to have in Jasenovac a person who is 100% loyal to him, and Dinko Sakic definitely was the person of that kind.
He would be much more than a mere administrator. His main concern would soon turn to extermination. Luburic began to draw up plans for Jasenovac after visiting Nazi concentration camps. Jasenovac and other camps in Croatia were modeled on the design and style of the German ones. Luburic had also observed the Nazis' latest experiments in mass murder, gas chambers, in which men, women, and children were suffocated with carbon monoxide from motor vehicles. But the guards at Jasenovac preferred altogether simpler methods of killing. The Jasenovac Memorial Museum in Croatia shows some of the gruesome artifacts from the original site. The displays include the Ustasha Guards' weapons of choice. One fearsome implement was a special blade known as the Serb cutter. It was devised to slit people's throats quickly and easily. One guard later boasted that he had slit the throats of some 1,300 prisoners with his Serb cutter. Inmates were also thrown into the ovens of a brick factory inside one of the camps at Jasenovac and burnt alive. Very few of those who survived Jasenovac are still alive to tell of their experiences. Pava Molnar was 20 years old when the Germans invaded and the independent state of Croatia was established. She was an active member of Zagreb's communist youth movement and was quickly arrested and sent to Jasenovac.
Srpkinje I Židovke su otišle u Kulu. U Kuli je bila najobična voda ili je bila onaj pokvareni luk u vodi ili kupus. To je bilo osuđeno na smrt. Takve štakore sigurno niko nije video, to su ko mačke velike šakore, one su jednostavno plazile po ljudima, grizle uši, dok jednostavno one nisu mogle braniti. Ja sam vidjela recimo kamion sa ustašama, sa lopatama i žene idu gore na kamione, one viču, a gdje su naše stvari? A oni kažu, doći će za vama. Drugi dan te nismo vidjeli. Prema tome, masu tih žena morali su nestati. A gdje su nestali, nego da su ubijene.
By now, the Nazis were progressing with their program of extermination, gassing hundreds of thousands of Jews. Their death camps saw human suffering on a vast, unimaginable scale. Although it hardly seems possible, the killing techniques employed by the Ustasha in Croatia were even more sadistic. The regime at Jasenovac was so violent and brutal, it disturbed even the Nazis. Heinrich Himmler, head of the German SS, regularly received reports from German eyewitnesses in Croatia. One of them recorded in 1942.
The Ustasha committed their deeds in a bestial manner, not only against males of conscript age, but especially against helpless old people, women and children. The number of the Orthodox that the Croats have massacred and sadistically tortured to death is about 300,000.
Ja sam vidjela kad su došli recimo žene iz Kostajnice, pa smo mi morali Hrvatice njih pregledavati, jer Ustaša stoji i gleda i mi njima šapćemo, mi smo isto što i vi, predajte što imate. Naravno, slušajte, ako je neko imao u šavu ili u gumbu ne znam, sačuvao koji nova. Ustaša je za nama išao, pregledao ih je, one su se poplašile, one su sve počele bacati one novce koje su imali. On je postrojio njih 10 i odmah je to je ono što smo mi vidjeli.
Eventually, the Ustasha became worried about the stories of torture and mass murder at Jasenovac. To put an end to the gossip, the Pavelić regime commissioned a series of photographs. They showed inmates in the camp doing useful work for the war effort. But beyond the reach of the camera lens, the cruelty and mass murder continued without let-up.
Kad su te kolone iz Kozaraške dolazili sa djecom, onda su oni tu djecu odvojili od majke. To su mala djeca, neka tek rođena, neke do 15 godina. Oni su ih odvajali i to nije bilo u Kuli, jer nije bilo mjesta u Kuli, to je van Kule bilo. Oni su tu, to je krik, ja mislim da je cijela Gradiška od tih jauka, od te djece vriskali. To je ono što se ne može oprostiti. To je strašno. Onda su ta djeca na koncu u jednom posebnom zgradu bili. Neke naše Hrvatice su oko njih malo vodile računa. Naravno da su sve to od proljiva, od tifusa, od gladi, sve to umrlo.
But even as the brutality at Jasenovac continued, underground resistance movements began to spring up throughout Yugoslavia. by the end of 1942, the Pavelić regime, together with its German and Italian allies, had its hands full fighting the growing number of partisans resisting fascist occupation. Led by Croat communist leader Josef Broz Tito and supplied and trained by the British and the Americans, this guerrilla army now presented a mortal threat to the Pavelić regime.
Tito's partisans came into the middle of the conflict offering something what they called brotherhood and unity. We want to win the war against the Nazis, fascists, and collaborators. We are offering a solution.
The war against the partisans was fought without pity. Hundreds of thousands of civilians as well as partisans were killed. However, the guerrilla army managed to hold out. And time was running out for Dinko Sakic and his fellow Ustasha killers at the Jasenovac concentration camp. In the autumn of 1944, the Russian army continued its westward drive into Europe by advancing deep into the Balkans. By October, Soviet troops had linked up with Tito's partisans, and together they liberated the Yugoslav capital, Belgrade. The Croatian puppet state was now under serious threat. Dinko Sakic was ordered to kill all the survivors at Jasenovac and obliterate the evidence. Sakic ordered his men to carry out what became known as the Autumn Liquidation. For 20 days, they selected the sick and the old among the prisoners and executed them. Afterwards, they threw their bodies into the Sava River. In April 1945, Tito's partisans arrived at Jasenovac. They found nothing but ruins, rotting bodies, and huge piles of clothing stolen from the dead. Investigations began into just how many people had died at Jasenovac at the hands of Dinko Sakic and his Ustasha comrades in the previous 4 years. But in the absence of documents which had all been destroyed, no reliable figure was ever produced. Historians now believe that an estimated 1 million Yugoslav citizens perished between 1941 and 1945. It's thought that 1/3 of these, over 300,000, died at Jasenovac. In May 1945, the Germans surrendered to the victorious Allies, and the independent state of Croatia collapsed like a pack of cards. Thousands of Ustasha members fled alongside German troops and found refuge in prison camps run by the British in neighboring Italy and Austria. The British were ignorant of Croatian involvement in Nazi crimes, so they made little effort to look for Pavelić and his closest Ustasha comrades. Dinko Sakic was one of those who evaded the roundup. Some now believe that his escape was aided by members of the Roman Catholic Church. It's thought they received help from a senior member of the Catholic Church, closely linked to the Vatican. With money and false papers supplied by this Catholic rat line, they were able to seek a new life abroad, with South America as one of the most popular destinations. Zagreb, 1946. The Catholic Church found itself on trial for its support of the Ustasha regime. Unable to catch any of the key players, such as Pavelic, Luburic, or Sakic, the communist government of Joseph Tito put Archbishop Stepanic in the dock. He was tried for collaboration with the Ustasha and for permitting the forcible conversion of Serbs from Orthodox Christianity to Catholicism. Stepanic was found guilty of treason and war crimes. It was a verdict that usually meant the death penalty, but Stepanic got off with just 16 years. Amazingly, after just 5 years behind bars, he was released. Then in 1998, in a move that polarized public opinion not only in Croatia, but in the wider world, Pope John Paul II declared Archbishop Stepanic a martyr, and he was beatified, a major step towards becoming a saint. And at the same time, there was more bad news for the Catholic Church. A secret document released by the US Treasury Department revealed that for the previous 50 years, the Vatican had held on to some 200 million Swiss francs, plundered from Serbs and Jews by the Ustasha.
Ella para nosotros, paso de la historia de la nación.
Meanwhile, Dinko Sakic was enjoying the hospitality of Argentina's president, Colonel Juan Perón. Perón was a charismatic leader who admired right-wing European dictators and even styled himself on them. He regarded men like Sakic and Pavelic as heroes in the struggle against godless communism and welcomed them with open arms. Benefiting from Argentine government protection, Sakic and his wife Nada settled down in the South Atlantic coastal resort of Santa Teresita, just outside Buenos Aires, and there raised a family. Sakic lived quietly in Argentina under the name Lubomir Sakic Belanovic and set up a textile factory. He remained active in Ustasha emigre politics, and so did his former wartime chief, and Pavelic.
Durante estas luchas, el reino...
Then in 1958, Pavelic made a rare appearance on television, justifying his past as Croatia's wartime fascist dictator.
El Estado Independiente de Croacia fue proclamado el día 10 de abril de 1941, después de la insurrección general del pueblo croata encabezada por el movimiento Ustasha.
A year later, Pavelic was murdered, the victim of an assassin working for Tito's secret police. But Dinko Sakic stayed safely in the shadows. Then, after almost half a century's exile in Argentina, the past began to catch up with him. In 1990, Croatian independence raised its head yet again. 10 years earlier, President Tito had died, and although he'd managed to keep his beloved Yugoslavia together, now it was about to break apart. Croats voiced their desire for independence once more. Their newly elected leader, Franjo Tuđman, had always been a loyal supporter of Tito. But as Yugoslavia began to implode, Tuđman took up the cause of Croatian nationalism.
Na povjerenju što ste nam ga očitovali izborom na ovu časnu I odgovornu dužnost.
This was the cue for civil war to break out. The Serbs, who had not forgotten the crimes committed by the Ustasha against them, went to war against the Croats. And so began a new war in the Balkans, a war that would last for most of the 1990s and would involve all of the peoples of the former Yugoslavia. As hundreds of thousands of people were massacred or forced to flee from their homes, a new phrase entered modern political vocabulary: ethnic cleansing. But for men like Dinko Sakic, ethnic cleansing was nothing new. That had been their task at Jasenovac. With renewed interest in Croatia's violent history, journalists in Argentina and abroad began to seek out Dinko Sakic to hear his views. In 1998, 50 years after fleeing Croatia with his wife Nada, Dinko Sakic made a serious error of judgment. One day, a reporter from Argentinian TV program Telenoche knocked on his door requesting an interview. Sakic agreed and invited him in. Hardly able to believe his luck, the TV reporter wanted to gain Sakic's trust, so his first question was intended to make Sakic feel at ease.
¿Cuándo vino de Europa?
Yo vine a la Argentina el día 22 de diciembre de 1947 por la mañana.
¿Y en qué circunstancias? ¿Cómo
como inmigrante, porque pasamos un grupo de croatas, como 500 croatas llegaron con una visa múltiple que el gobierno argentino en el primer momento otorgó para emigrados croatas. Yo tenía ya obtenido antes la visa de inmigración y vinimos con como 150, un grupo de 150 con el buque Tucumán.
The TV reporter now began to probe a little deeper into Sakic's past.
Soy patriota croata que lucha por mi pueblo. Y así yo ya empecé. Entonces era el hombre de confianza.
Usted estuvo en Jasenovac también.
¿Cómo?
Usted estuvo en Jasenovac también.
Para decir, sí, por ahí sí estaba en una unidad. Allá.
Dinko Sakic was uncomfortable owning up to being at Jasenovac, but the TV reporter persisted.
Usted fue comandante del campo al final.
No, fue director, no comandante. Fue nombrado, fue 100 días nomás. Mire, cuando yo estaba, no había ningún guardia ni ningún administrativo que podría tocarle a un prisionero de cualquier, sea judío.
Recuérdeme las fechas. Esto fue entre el 41 y el 44.
42, en diciembre 42 y octubre de 44.
En esa época no se podía tocar a los prisioneros.
Yo, mire, no hablo lo que era antes ni lo que era después, pero mientras yo estaba nadie podía tocar. Nadie podía tocar a nadie. Ellos tenían sus normas internas. Y si alguno ha hecho algo, entonces la administración interna lo castigaba con lo que sea.
Entre fines del 42 y fines del 44 no se mató a nadie.
Yo no vi ni se mató. Que nosotros no teníamos interés en matar a la gente. Necesitábamos gente para trabajar, para abastecernos.
When the Telenoche interview was shown on Argentinian television, it created a sensation. Dinko Sakic had finally stepped out of the shadows into the full glare of publicity. And the consequences for him would be disastrous. Efraim Zurov, one of the most senior Nazi hunters at the Simon Wiesenthal Center, got to hear about Sakic's TV appearance. He immediately set about securing his extradition to stand trial. In the Croatian capital of Zagreb, the reaction to Sakic's public reappearance placed President Tudjman in a dilemma. Tudjman saw himself as a Croatian patriot, proud of his country's wartime history. He had used it to help rebuild his country. He had even argued that the death toll at Jasenovac had been inflated. According to Tudjman's version of history, Sakic was a freedom fighter and an honorable Croat patriot. But in the mid-1990s, Tudjman needed to demonstrate to the world, especially to the United States, that Croatia was a modern, pro-Western democracy. Americans in particular regarded Sakic as a Nazi collaborator and sadistic killer, one of the last living commandants of a World War II death camp.
¡Asesino! ¡Asesino! ¡Cárceles! ¡Cárceles a los asesinos!
Within weeks of the Telenoche interview, Dinko Sakic was arrested. The media descended on the quiet neighborhood.
¿Qué fue lo que dijo?
No dijo nada, no estuve delante de él. No estuve, para nada habló, conmigo no habló nada.
In similar cases, the Argentinian authorities had reacted very slowly to calls from abroad for the arrest and repatriation of old Nazi war criminals. But this time, the response was different.
Are you a killer, Mr. Sakic?
Dinko Sakic was soon on his way back to Croatia to face justice at last.
I think that it's fair to say this could be an important milestone for Croatian society. This trial will be a litmus test for the new Croatia, for the country which seeks to fully integrate itself into the West. We should be thinking of the victims of the Ustasha regime, anti-fascist Croats, Serbs, Jews, and Gypsies. They are the ones who deserve our sympathy and our empathy.
On June 18th, 1998, Dinko Sakic arrived back in Croatia for the first time since the end of World War II. His wife Nada came with him. She too had served at Jasenovac, specifically in the women's camp. She was therefore implicated in war crimes and now faced interrogation by the authorities.
She was deeply involved in that manner, that she knew what was going on, that she saw people who were persecuted and killed. She cannot say that it didn't happen.
Dinko Sakic's trial finally opened in November 1998 at the Zagreb District Court. He was charged with the deaths of thousands of prisoners while he had been the commandant at Jasenovac. More than 30 witnesses, including camp survivors, testified against him. However, throughout the trial, Sakic maintained his innocence. The professor of Croatian contemporary history at Zagreb University, Dr. Ivo Goldstein, was called as an expert witness.
When I was speaking, he was laughing when I was speaking about the Ustasha system of terror, but he was laughing when some other witnesses were speaking as well, so it was not nothing new. The judge was warning him a couple of times, Mr. Sakic, don't laugh, it's not funny, don't laugh. And he was laughing again and again and again.
Sakic was eventually found guilty of killing or condoning the killing of more than 2,000 Serbs, Jews, and Gypsies. he was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, the maximum penalty available at the time. The trial judge said his lack of remorse contributed to the length of the sentence. Although interrogated, Nada Sakic never stood trial. For most people, Croatia had finally faced up to its fascist past. In July 2008, Dinko Sakic died in a prison hospital, aged 86. He was no Heinrich Himmler or even Ant Pavelic. He was just a small cog in a big machine. A machine that had given him the power of life and death over thousands of human beings. To the very end of his life, he felt he had no need to apologize to anybody for his actions. The crimes of Dinko Sakic and his Ustaša comrades were committed in the name of the people of Croatia. Even today, there are many of his countrymen and women who believe that Sakic was no war criminal, but a heroic fighter in the cause of freedom for their nation. They believe that his victims, the Serbs, Jews, communists and gypsies, were the real criminals, not Dinko Sakic. In their eyes, Sakic's collaboration with the Nazis was in defense of their nation and the Holy Catholic faith. Dinko Sakic's remains are held here, in the main cemetery in central Zagreb. At his funeral, the Roman Catholic priest told the mourners that he was proud he had seen Sakic in his coffin, dressed in an Ustaša uniform. He added, "Every honorable Croat is proud of the name Dinko Sakic." But not every Croat agrees. For many, the Ustaša regime is a brutal and bloody memory of the country's history. A memory that must never be forgotten.
Svi su Ustaše bili jednaki. Tamo nema Ustaša koji ne bi napravio, a da mu se nešto ne kaže ili se mu ne radi. Tako ga tamo nema. Tako da ja o tome pričam kao jednom zlo koje je bio, koje se više neće ponoviti, jer verujem da se više ne može ponoviti tako nešto, jel? A da onih koji nema, to je, mi još uvijek živimo i sa onima kojih nema.
Vidkun Quisling. His name means traitor. To be a Quisling is to be a Judas, and few men were more of a Nazi collaborator than this man.
A vile race of Quisling is hired to fawn upon the conqueror, to collaborate in his designs.
As Hitler's Norwegian inside man, Vidkun Quisling betrayed his country and paved the way for Nazi invasion and occupation. In return, Quisling believed Hitler would make him the Norwegian Führer. But instead, the Nazis found out he just wasn't up to it. He was incompetent and rotten at his job. So Norway, the country that Quisling claimed to love, had to be swallowed up into the Reich. Quisling was sidelined. He became a cartoon hate figure, a puppet lampooned by the Allies, despised by his countrymen, and with none of the power he so craved. How did Vidkun Quisling get it all so wrong? Was World War II's most notorious Nazi collaborator a fool, evil, or simply insane? The man whose name would become synonymous with collaboration was born in 1887 in the Telemark region of Norway. The son of a Lutheran clergyman, he had a strict upbringing. After school, he attended a military academy and became a major. Then in the 1920s, there was an event in Russia that would affect him deeply. The country was suffering a terrible famine as a result of the communist revolution and years of civil war. Vast swathes of the country became a wasteland. Disease, starvation, and poverty were everywhere. Millions died. Quisling was sent to the Ukraine to coordinate the relief effort. He worked for the League of Nations Aid Committee in Russia. He witnessed firsthand the devastation. In his eyes, suffering and inequality all prospered under communism. Nonetheless, Quisling did well in Russia. As attaché in Moscow, he represented British interests, and the British government even awarded him the CBE. But after he returned to Norway in December 1929, his views on communism became increasingly hard-line. He saw it as a menace that threatened his beloved country. Then came the Great Depression, which affected the lives of everyone. Beginning in America, it spread like a contagion across Europe. Its legacy was the financial meltdown of the whole continent. Millions lost their jobs. Crime increased, and rioting spread. Norway was not immune. It was hit by a wave of strikes and civil unrest, all spawned by the Great Depression. As society collapsed, Quisling became fearful that this chaos would become a breeding ground for Norwegian communism. So, he decided to take action and enter politics, using it as a weapon to halt the spread of communism. Then in 1931, he had an unexpected break. A high-level post as Minister of Defense in the government. This was his big chance to do something in his campaign against communism. But he blew it. In June 1931, there was a communist-led strike at a Norsk Hydro industrial plant. Quisling sent in the army, and it didn't go down well. The relationship between Quisling and his fellow ministers soured. Then, after just 2 years, the government fell. Now, Quisling looked for inspiration, and he found it in Germany.
Und nun ein Wahnsinniger oder ein bewusster Lügner kann denken, dass ich oder irgendjemand jemals die Absicht hätten, Sieg heil!
January 1933. Adolf Hitler rose to power. In just 12 years, he had created a successful mass fascist movement. Quisling was smitten. The Nazis' tough stance on communism, that was what Norway so badly needed. Their idea of the great leader, the totalitarian Führer, that could be him. And the German notion of a powerful national identity, a fatherland to which everyone and everything was subjugated, that could work in Norway and unite the divided country. So, Quisling hatched a plan to create a Norwegian fascist movement, modelled exactly on the Nazis. He founded National Samling, National Union, in May 1933. As leader, Führer in Norwegian, all members had to show blind obedience to him. They adopted the Roman salute. And Quisling created his own paramilitary thugs, just like Hitler's brown shirts, known as the Herd. His party even adopted the Sun Cross as their symbol, which bore a resemblance to the swastika. Their uniforms were emblazoned with a flying eagle, just like the Nazi emblem. And in the same way as Hitler had risen to power with a 25-point plan, Quisling drew up a list of 30 things he would change. They included abolishing unemployment. He never explained how. Censoring the press, banning strikes, and the sterilization of undesirables. But Quisling differed from the Nazis in 3 key areas. He never mentioned anti-Semitism, never chose to call his party National Socialist, and he maintained party ties to Christianity. 6 months after he founded it, his fledgling NS movement was put to the test.
Norske kvinner, norske menn, å forstå sin tid, gjøre seg dens oppgaver.
Quisling hit the campaign trail, ready for the October 1933 elections.
I sin historiske tale onsdag 25. september sa den tyske rikskommissær Terboven.
Unlike Hitler, he was no charismatic orator, and the elections showed it.
For en fremtidig nasjonal norsk løsning av den nuværende situasjon.
His party gained just 2.2% of the vote, not a single seat in parliament, and did just a little better than their detested rivals, the communists. 3 years later, in the 1936 general election, he did even worse. National Samling had completely failed to capture popular support. It remained confined to the margins of Norwegian politics. A lunatic fringe. Then in the summer of 1939, whilst attending a conference in the German port of Lübeck, Quisling's fortunes turned. He met Alfred Rosenberg, Hitler's most senior foreign policy advisor. Rosenberg had recognized Quisling's potential as a German ally and set out to entice him to the Nazi cause. Quisling was taken on a whirlwind tour of Berlin. Meeting prominent Nazis and military figures, including Admiral Raeder, the head of the German Navy. It looked like he had finally found like-minded allies who would support him. With the help of the Nazis, he could at last become a great leader and change Norwegian politics forever. And soon, events would come together and give Quisling the opportunity to exploit his new contacts. But it would come at a heavy price. September 1939. Britain and France were forced to declare war on Germany. A dark cloud descended over the whole of Europe. The German Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, finished off Poland in just over a month. Now the German war effort needed two things: iron ore to make steel and armaments, and ships to expand its fleet. Norway offered both. Quisling quickly realized that Hitler needed the Norwegians. With Rosenberg's help, he traveled back to Berlin in December 1939 to meet more senior Nazis. This time, he had a plan. In the meeting, he set out his stall to Alfred Rosenberg. Quisling proposed to stage a coup d'etat in the capital, Oslo. He would set up a new government with himself as Führer. Then he would invite the Germans to land in Norway. The plan met with Nazi approval. To help the German landings, he gave Admiral Raeder secret intelligence regarding defense agreements with Britain and Norwegian naval forces. And he made a promise. Quisling guaranteed that the Norwegian people would support his coup. This meeting was a huge turning point in Quisling's life. He was taken right to the top to meet the Führer himself for the first time. Quisling was granted an audience with Adolf Hitler on the 14th of December 1939. Though this meeting was held behind closed doors with no minutes, Rosenberg wrote in his diary that Quisling seemed very satisfied with the talks. The Norwegian met the Führer again on the 18th, when Hitler assured him that his plan for a takeover would receive the military backing of Germany. Unbeknownst to his people back in Norway, Quisling had done a deal with the Germans. He would become Führer in Norway, and in return, allow the Germans to maintain a purely military presence to deter any British or French attacks. Quisling was overjoyed. He seemed to have the deal he needed, and his route to ultimate power appeared certain. As he flew back to Norway, the Germans were getting ready. Norwegian insurgents were trained and a list of military targets drawn up. But what Quisling didn't know was that Hitler was planning to take over Norway before he was ready. On the 3rd of April 1940, Quisling traveled to Copenhagen to meet with the deputy head of the German intelligence service. He passed over yet more military secrets to Hitler's spies. Then, less than a week later, the Germans struck.
After 7 months, the war has suddenly flared up into a tremendous conflagration with the Nazi invasion of Norway and Denmark.
Norway was invaded on the 9th of April 1940. It was a spectacular military operation that surprised everyone. Even Quisling was caught unawares. The German Navy attempted to sail right up to Oslo. And Luftwaffe transports dropped paratroopers to seize key targets. Seeing the Germans had invaded without waiting for him, Vidkun Quisling reacted and tried to regain the initiative. He seized the Oslo radio transmitter and proclaimed himself Norwegian Prime Minister. He announced that he spoke for the whole nation and called a halt to hostilities. Germany, he said, had promised to guarantee Norwegian freedom and independence and had acted to protect her from British aggression. The move seemed to work. Hitler agreed to recognize his government immediately.
This was one of the most amazing acts of treachery the world has ever known. It brought Major Quisling international fame, making his very name synonymous with the word traitor.
Virtually overnight, Quisling was seen as a Judas around the world, especially in London. The British press in particular used his name as a byword for traitor from that moment on.
A vile race of Quislings, to use a new word which will carry the scorn of mankind down the centuries, is hired to fawn upon the conqueror, to collaborate in his designs.
But right from the start, it all went wrong for Quisling. King Håkon, the Norwegian monarch, refused to accept Quisling's government. He labeled Quisling's regime as illegitimate, and his claim to speak for the nation false. King Håkon led a fight back, first from Norway, then from London. Bitter fighting continued, especially in the north around Narvik, a vital strategic port, crucial for the transportation of iron ore. The Royal Navy fought Hitler's navy in the waters near Narvik. On land, Norwegian ground forces fought alongside British, French, and Polish troops in the mountains that surrounded the port. It was all a massive embarrassment for Quisling. It showed that he didn't have the situation under control. Despite having promised Hitler in their previous meetings that he could rally the whole country, it was patently clear that he could not. Hitler realized he would have to pacify Norway himself, and he soon moved to control the situation without Quisling. Within 6 days of the invasion, Hitler put his own man in charge of Norway. Josef Terboven was appointed Reichskommissar on the 20th of April 1940. Terboven was a man with serious Nazi pedigree, and his task was to bring Norway under direct control of the Reich. He became the supreme authority, and he was good at his job. By June 1940, all resistance ceased, and the nation capitulated. The parliament was dissolved in August. Norway, the country that Quisling had wanted to lead, was swallowed up by Hitler's empire. But Quisling wasn't quite finished. Hitler still had plans for him. Terboven was ordered by Hitler to work with Quisling and create a temporary puppet government with a facade of legality. The goal was then to build NS into a popular party and prepare Quisling for power, allowing the Germans to withdraw. Quisling chaired a cabinet formed in the autumn of 1941, known as the Council of Ministers. But behind the scenes, Terboven was firmly in charge. Together, he and Quisling set about Nazifying Norway. Now Norwegians would find out what life under the Nazis was like. Political parties were banned, as were public meetings. The press was censored, free speech outlawed, and the population was told rationing would be introduced. Quisling approved all of it. As Hitler had requested, he then went on a drive to expand his party and popularity. Once again, Vidkun Quisling hit the campaign trail. But yet again, his recruitment drive failed abysmally, even though there wasn't any political opposition. Quisling could still only muster some 20,000 out of the 100,000 members he aimed for. It was another embarrassment for the self-styled Führer, and more proof that he wasn't the popular leader he claimed to be. The Nazi strategy to build him up was failing. But he still had grand plans. In 1941, Heinrich Himmler himself had come to Oslo to see the inauguration of the Standarte Nordland, an SS military unit grouping Scandinavian volunteers in SS Division Viking. But Quisling wanted to build something bigger and better. He wanted to show Norway was indispensable to the war effort and win Hitler's favor. He offered to provide his own personal Führerguard of Norwegian volunteers. And soon there came a chance to create it. June 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's much-awaited invasion of Russia finally began. It should have been the perfect excuse for Quisling to create his own elite fighting force. But his rival Terboven beat him to it. Terboven summoned recruits for a legion of Norwegian volunteers to fight for Hitler. Similar to SS Nordland, but grander in scale, with their own national uniforms, Norwegian officers, and to placate Quisling, allegiance to him. To make the legion more appealing to Norwegians, Terboven promised they would only fight on the Finnish front. Quisling had no choice but to endorse his rival's legion. He urged all Norwegians to join. Again, volunteers were found from his paramilitaries, the Herd. 1,200 joined in total. But in the end, nothing happened as he had wanted. The unit never wore Norwegian uniforms, but German SS uniforms instead. They were made to swear an oath of allegiance not to Quisling, but to Hitler. And to make matters worse, they ended up in a dangerous hotspot on the German front line in Russia, not on the Finnish front. The Norwegian legionnaires saw action around Leningrad. There, they besieged the city for months. It was some of the toughest fighting in the whole of Russia. Many were killed in combat or by the bitter cold. What's more, the SS High Command complained about their attitude. They didn't show the proper respect for orders and suffered from poor fighting spirit. In the end, the Legion was disbanded. Not only had Quisling's idea been hijacked and the Norwegian Legion failed, but all it had achieved was to deplete the numbers of his NS party even further. The more party faithful were killed, the more his power base was shrinking. And yet again, he had failed to please the Nazis. Meanwhile, in London, events were occurring that would discredit him even more and see his grasp on power slip still further. Winston Churchill's secret army, the Special Operations Executive, had been given strict orders to start a reign of chaos in occupied Europe. It was held by the Norwegian government in exile. SOE managed to create an extremely effective network of Norwegian spies and agents known as the Home Front Army. The Home Front Army began to plan sabotage and assassinations of NS members and Nazi sympathizers. More and more young men and women escaped Norway, often making the treacherous journey by boat to sign up. They were all desperate to get rid of the unpopular Quisling. They would crew 118 ships, fly in 4 squadrons and create an army brigade numbering 1,500 men. Norwegian volunteers also trained to fight as commandos in specialist British units. Their mission was to carry out military operations deep within occupied Norwegian territory. March 1941 saw the first chance to hit back at Vidkun Quisling. British commandos targeted the Lofoten Islands. They took with them the men they trained.
We have also on board Norwegian soldiers and sailors, men picked for their physique and initiative, their dash and enterprise, men brought to the peak of military efficiency by long and intensive training, and in high spirits too, for they're bound for their home country, Norway, to strike at the enemy in occupation.
The targets were tanks of fish oil used to make explosives. The operation was a tactical and propaganda success.
And that's Hitler's cod liver oil going up instead of down. Stacks of barrels of the precious liquid, vital for the Nazi war machine, are broken open and tipped into the harbor. Other parties have different work to do. The rounding up of Germans and Quislings and marching them off for interrogation.
Over 300 new volunteers left the islands and joined the convoy to fight for the Allies. The raiders even made a joke at Hitler's expense and sent a telegram teasing the Führer before they left.
Herr Hitler, reference your last speech. I thought you said that whenever British troops land on the continent of Europe, German soldiers will face them. Well, where are they?
300,000 German troops, badly needed elsewhere, had to be garrisoned in Norway doing nothing, simply to deter further Allied raids. Despite this, all Quisling's efforts seemed, on the surface, to be rewarded on the 1st of February 1942, when he became Minister-President, the head of state, even though Norway was still officially part of the Reich. He had all the trappings of power, a title, a sumptuous residence, and his head on the national postage stamp. But Quisling effectively remained on probation. Terboven was still in charge. He was a puppet, and his new puppet title came at a price, as Quisling became the figurehead of a clampdown and was forced to turn on his own people. Throughout 1942, the British attacks against Norway continued. And it wasn't just the commando raiders who inconvenienced Quisling. The home front army resistance movement inside Norway was growing in strength. Its campaign of sabotage and assassinations was working. Their most famous achievement, later immortalized on film, was the partial destruction of the Norsk Hydro heavy water plant in Telemark. It was one of a number of daring attacks right under the Minister-President's nose. Terboven was furious that the home front army could act with impunity. Quisling was at a loss how to react. Desperate to be taken seriously and bullied by Terboven, Quisling agreed to brutal reprisals. 6 commandos captured trying to sabotage the heavy water plant on a previous mission were executed. Murdering uniformed special forces was a war crime, which went against the Geneva Convention. Then, to contain the Norwegian resistance, innocent civilians became fair game. They were rounded up and tortured. Quisling let it happen. Nazi recriminations were particularly brutal at the hands of a notorious ex-Norwegian soldier named Henry Renan. Renan worked for the SS secret police, the SD. He led a gang of 40 Gestapo agents who infiltrated resistance networks. 1,000 people were arrested. Hundreds were murdered. Then in October 1942, Quisling went even further. He cooperated with the crime that made the Nazis so infamous. In Oslo, 750 Jews were arrested and deported to the Auschwitz death camp. Their property and wealth was stolen. Quisling's involvement made him even more unpopular. In the eyes of Norwegians, he had now sold his soul. In 1943, he made things even worse by advocating compulsory conscription. As head of state, he declared that Norway was at war with Russia and allied to the Reich. He wanted to pass an unpopular law allowing the Norwegian population to be called up to help the German war effort. He submitted plans to SS Chief Gottlob Berger for 75,000 conscripts. Norwegians were recruited to fight in German ski Jaeger units in Finland. Others were sent off to labor camps in Germany. In In 1944, he tried to mobilize yet more young Norwegians for compulsory labor service. Then he made his next fateful mistake. A popular Norwegian police chief, Gunnar Eilifsen, refused to execute 2 girls who had avoided compulsory labor service. The police chief was killed for insubordination. Minutes from a meeting with Terboven show that Quisling justified the use of capital punishment. Quisling's behavior was all the more incomprehensible, given the way the war was going. (1944) was a year of unmissable signs that the Reich would soon be finished. Over that summer, Germany suffered 2 simultaneous body blows. In the west, the Allies landed in Normandy. In the east, Russia's Operation Bagration obliterated a huge portion of the forces on the Eastern Front. All the other Hitler collaborators around Europe had gone by now too. Mussolini, Italy's fascist dictator. Antonescu, the former ally in Romania. Admiral Horthy, regent in Hungary. Fritz Clausen, collaborator in neighboring Denmark. The writing was on the wall for those who supported the Third Reich. Even the Führer himself had been the target of an assassination plot and coup. Yet Quisling refused to turn back. Bizarrely, it was only at this moment, as the Reich was collapsing, that Adolf Hitler finally had quality time for him. Even though the end seemed inevitable, he was summoned to meet Himmler and Hitler again in January 1945. The Nazis pulled out all the stops. Quisling saw Hitler no fewer than 3 times during his official state visit. He was whisked off to meet Goebbels and Ribbentrop too. At long last, he was finally being treated as a proper head of state. Quisling seemed to recover some of his statesmanship. He was determined to try and do a deal with Hitler one last time, to finally negotiate with him and regain independence for Norway. His idea was for a grand alliance uniting all Germanic peoples after the war. In exchange for its membership, a peace had to be signed with Norway, guaranteeing its independence. But Quisling's plan was hopeless. It depended on Germany winning the war, which was clearly not going to happen.
Dead Nazis and captured Nazis, men dazed and bewildered by the fury of the Allied attack. As the Russians sweep on, Germany sees certain doom on 2 fronts.
To make matters worse, Hitler was enraged by continued acts of sabotage in Norway and refused to accept any such treaty. Quisling's plan was rejected. From this point on, Quisling's actions became more and more delusional. In the dying days of the war, he offered citizenship to 400,000 German soldiers in Norway. He even suggested the idea of making Norway a fortress, Festung Norway, somewhere the Nazis could make a last stand against the Allies. But it was all too late.
The day of victory in Europe was the day of freedom for Norway, isolated from her allies since 1940. The first British party to enter Oslo is greeted by the chief of the German ground forces, putting up an oily show of friendship which is coldly rejected.
On the 8th of May 1945, the German army in Norway surrendered. The 40,000 home front forces emerged from hiding and joined the liberators. The Nazi regime was finished. Josef Terboven blew himself up in a bunker with a hand grenade. But Vidkun Quisling remained in a dream world. Incredibly, he thought he could form a working relationship with the home front forces. He received a curt reply from King Haakon's representatives. Hand yourself in or expect to be taken by force. The next day, a dazed and confused Quisling handed himself in at an Oslo police station. It was now time for retribution. Those Norwegians who had sided with the Nazis had to face their judgment. Henry Rinnan, the brutal police enforcer, faced his fate with a chilling smile. But Norway's former leader tried to put up a fight. In August, Quisling's trial began. It was held in a temporary courthouse in Oslo, created especially for the occasion. The eyes of the world's media were focused on Norway. Quisling welcomed the chance to set the record straight. He wanted to explain how the Norwegian people had got it all wrong, how he had tried to protect them from Terboven, not act as an agent of the Nazis. The prosecution was so bemused by Quisling's reasoning that they had him assessed to see if he was insane. The psychiatrists eventually determined he was not. He was charged with treason, orchestrating a coup, ordering Norwegian soldiers to down arms, and assisting Germany's war efforts and occupation. What's more, he stood accused of killing Norwegian patriots, like the police chief, Eilifsen. The prosecution called for the death penalty. Quisling would never accept he had done anything wrong. He maintained he had always tried to secure Norwegian independence. As his trial went on, more evidence began to stack up against him. Theft and embezzlement were also added to the list of crimes. But questioning quickly returned to his contacts with German Nazis and the matter of treason. Especially his meeting in Copenhagen, days before the invasion. Quisling flatly refused to admit any knowledge of the meeting and denied any prior knowledge of an invasion. Later, further evidence was submitted proving that he had met with Admiral Raeder, who had planned the German invasion of Norway. Quisling hit back with some impressive character witnesses who spoke up in his defense, but they could not defend his actions under the Nazis. His defense collapsed. Then, a key Jewish witness delivered more damning evidence. Leo Eitinger spoke at length about the deportation and gassing of Norwegian Jews. Quisling had been complicit in their deaths. In his final statement, he said, "I have been guided by two considerations: my love of Norway and my love of the Norwegian people." The judges withdrew to contemplate the verdict. Vidkun Quisling was sentenced to death on the 10th of September 1945. He had been found guilty of treason, murder, and theft. He was in shock. On the morning of the 24th of October 1945, Quisling was led to a courtyard at Akershus fortress, where a firing squad similar to this one awaited. He was blindfolded and prepared for death. As the shots rang out, Vidkun Quisling protested his innocence one last time. Right until the moment of death, Vidkun Quisling remained convinced he had done nothing wrong. But the truth was different. In fact, he was almost driven mad by his own contradictions. He was the patriot who betrayed his country, the nationalist who let his country be taken over, the man who loved his people but also oppressed them. He was the figurehead who claimed to speak for a whole nation but spoke for no one. A man of faith who was complicit in the murder of Jews. Vidkun Quisling was convinced he could rally millions, but failed. And thought he could deal with Adolf Hitler, and was wrong. In the end, these contradictions tore him apart, and he paid for them with his life. May the 5th, 1940. Just before daybreak, a single German aircraft flew a secret mission over the British Isles. On board was a First World War veteran and Nazi spy, codename Gilka. His mission was to make contact with Nazi collaborators. Together, they were to execute Plan Kathleen. Gilka floated silently down beneath his parachute and touched down in the Irish Republic. His aim was to plan the Nazi invasion of Northern Ireland. Those collaborators he was meeting? A group of Irish terrorists, the IRA. And so would begin one of the most bizarre stories of Nazi collaboration of World War II.
In terms of the IRA's history, that collaboration or attempted collaboration is now really an embarrassment.
To a large extent, it appears in retrospect as comedy or tragedy, depending on your point of view.
It's a series of events that the IRA would rather forget. It would lead to unbearable tension between the British and Irish governments. And if the plan had succeeded, it could have lost Britain the war. So why did the IRA collaborate with the Nazis? Was it just clear-cut hatred for the British? Had they been seduced with promises of a united and independent Ireland? And did they really understand the kind of people they were dealing with? Just 8 months before the outbreak of World War II, a series of terrorist attacks, as skillfully coordinated as any by Al-Qaeda, were felt all over England. Bombs exploded in power stations and substations from Northumberland to Manchester, from Liverpool to London. This was the work of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, the notorious terrorist group fighting for a united Ireland. And this campaign was part of something that they called the S Plan. S stood for sabotage. In Britain, there was outrage. In response, the police arrested 66 terrorists and seized 1,500 sticks of gelignite, along with 2 tons of the highly explosive potassium chlorate. But the bombing went on. But one group of observers looked on, not with horror, but with admiration. The Nazis decided that here were people they could do business with. War with Britain was just months away, and these terrorists looked like they could be useful. So they began to search for someone they could trust to track down these potential allies. The man they found, Oscar Faus, had made his name fundraising in the United States of America on behalf of the Nazis. Before it entered the war, the USA had its own pockets of Nazi support, particularly in Chicago and New York. Faus's English was good, and when he returned home to Germany in December 1938, he was recruited to German military intelligence, the Abwehr, where he was soon presented with a challenging mission.
They immediately sent Oscar Faus to Ireland in February 1939 to make contact with the IRA and to explore the possibility of cooperation. Oscar Faus was ill-informed. He didn't know how to contact the IRA, but nonetheless, by a roundabout route, he would make contact with the IRA.
Eventually, he met the 2 most senior members of the organization, Chief of Staff Sean Russell and Head of Bomb-making Seamus O'Donovan. Both Russell and O'Donovan were veterans of the Irish struggle for independence. All of Ireland had been under British rule since 1801. On Easter Monday 1916, hundreds of members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood seized key locations in Dublin and proclaimed the Irish Republic independent of Britain. O'Donovan and Russell were officers in the Dublin Brigade of the IRB. So too was Eamon de Valera, who later as Prime Minister of Ireland would be forced to confront them as adversaries. The rebels were no match for the British armoured cars, artillery and machine guns. After 7 days of fighting, the Republicans were beaten. The IRB lost over 300 men, and more than 3,000 were arrested and interned. Among them, Sean Russell, Seamus O'Donovan, and Eamon de Valera. But they were lucky. 15 were executed without trial. The legacy of the Rising was to drive many more Irish into the hands of the Republican movements. In 1920, all IRB prisoners were released. The group was renamed the Irish Republican Army, and it began a bloody guerrilla war with the British. After fierce fighting and over 5,000 IRA deaths, a truce was agreed. In 1921, the Anglo-Irish Treaty was signed, creating an independent Ireland in the south, but the 6 counties of the north would remain under British rule. Eamon de Valera was vehemently opposed to the partition, but chose to pursue a political solution. He would become Prime Minister in 1932. But for others, the separation of the North and South was unacceptable. Seamus O'Donovan, Sean Russell, and the IRA turned back to the bullet and the bomb. It was a decision that would set them on a collision course with their former IRA comrade.
As far as the IRA are concerned, they are as opposed to the government in Dublin, which they saw as puppets of the British, as they are to the British continuing to control Northern Ireland. And the IRA are a substantial enough force in the 1920s and in the early 1930s in Ireland. They still have, upwards of maybe 15,000 men. They're still attempting to arm and train and bring in new recruits.
The IRA regrouped and retrained under the watchful eyes of a new and determined leader.
Sean Russell becomes leader of the IRA in 1938, and in many ways he's the archetypical IRA militarist. He has very little interest in wider politics. He says, we've done enough talking, we've had enough division over politics, this has got us nowhere. What people want from the IRA is a campaign to drive the British from Ireland. He comes to leadership in the IRA by promising a campaign.
Sean Russell, now Chief of Staff, appointed Seamus O'Donovan as his Director of Chemicals, that is, Chief Bomb Maker. It was they who devised the S-Plan.
The idea is that they'll be able to cause so much disruption that they'll put Ireland back on the headlines in Britain, that the British public will be forced to become aware of the partition of Ireland, and that therefore they'll put pressure on the British government as a result.
But now, as war grew closer, the two became increasingly interested in how Germany could help their cause, and relished the contact with German spy Oskar Faust.
They weren't driven by attraction to Nazism as an ideology. They were driven by this nationalist impulse to achieve unification and the ending of partition. And everybody who would assist in that was welcome.
On the basis that my enemy's enemy is my friend, O'Donovan made 3 trips to Germany in 1939 to meet German intelligence, the Abwehr. He was always escorted by his new German friend, the Nazi spy, Oskar Faust. At the first meeting in February, he discussed the supply of German arms and ammunition, but the Germans were not convinced, and he returned to Ireland armed only with a code name, Agent Hero. With Oskar Faust, he went back in April 1939, and again in August, where this time he was taken more seriously. At this last meeting at the German Foreign Office was Joseph McGarrity, an American IRA fundraiser. Seen here with Sean Russell in New York City, McGarrity is thought to have provided the cash to fund the S-Plan. McGarrity's job was to show the Nazis that there would be cash to back up the IRA's actions. O'Donovan returned to Ireland with a radio transmitter and a code for his Nazi contacts. But O'Donovan and Oskar Faust also carried a message from the Abwehr. It had told them that Hitler would supply German reinforcements if the IRA could devise a foolproof way of helping them defeat the British. But almost immediately, the relationship got off to a shaky start. The IRA couldn't work out how to reach Germany with the Abwehr radio. The signal was either too weak or was blocked. And it wasn't long before Eamon de Valera's Irish intelligence services were listening in.
As a result of their incompetence and ineptness and lack of radio training, the Marconi transmitter was quickly located. At that point, there was no communication between Abwehr and the IRA.
Though communications had broken down, the IRA would live to fight another day. On the 25th of August, they brought the S-Plan to Coventry. An IRA volunteer left a bicycle outside a shop in the city centre. In the basket was 5 pounds of high explosive. The timer was set for 2:30 in the morning, but the bomber planted the device at midday, and the bomb went off in the afternoon. 5 people were killed instantly. The outcry was muffled when 9 days later, Britain declared war on Germany. But the actions of the IRA and their S-plan would lead to bitter clashes between the British and Irish governments. Because the war created huge problems for Irish Prime Minister Eamon de Valera. The former IRA freedom fighter knew that it was politically unacceptable to support his nation's former rulers. Ireland had only just won its freedom after years of bloody suppression. Equally, though he was sympathetic to the IRA's demand for a reunified Ireland, he had no intention of reopening old wounds.
You asked me what are my hopes for the future relations between the peoples of Ireland and Great Britain. I have always said that I desired to establish friendly relations between the two peoples. That is still my desire and hope. But the historic Irish nation has been artificially divided.
De Valera had to tread a fine political line. Though the Irish were certainly not pro-British, they also didn't want the Nazis to succeed. It was simply not possible for de Valera's Irish Republic to join Britain as an ally, though in fact many individuals did join up in the struggle against Hitler. De Valera decided that Ireland should remain neutral.
De Valera has to walk a very narrow tightrope in 1939, 1940, because there is generally popular support for the policy of neutrality, for staying out of the war. And de Valera is very anxious to maintain neutrality, despite being under pressure from Britain, for example, to come in on the Allied side.
Maintaining Ireland's neutrality would create enormous tension between Dublin and London. De Valera angered the British because the German and Japanese embassies remained open for business in Dublin. They were an obvious security risk. And de Valera also refused to allow the British to use Irish ports as bases, an act that caused great concern in the Royal Navy.
While the loss of the use of the Southern Irish ports is a severe handicap to the Navy in its ceaseless life and death struggle in the Atlantic, their acquisition by Germany would be a disaster.
The Southern Irish ports were critical because before the war they had kept Britain supplied with food and equipment.
In my view, the starvation of this island, rather than its invasion, is still Hitler's aim, and to achieve this, a German seizure of the South Irish ports may well be on his agenda.
The threat of starvation was even more likely to succeed because de Valera had allowed German ships to use Irish waters. British convoys bringing supplies across the Atlantic were forced to divert to the longer northern approaches, leaving them vulnerable to attack by German U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic would eventually be won, but only after the loss of over 3,500 ships and more than 30,000 men.
The hour of victory is postponed, and therefore soldiers as well as sailors go to their graves, with every ship sunk in the Battle of the Atlantic. Yet Mr. de Valera will not budge.
But the one thing he did agree to was to turn on the IRA. While he staunchly defended the right to Irish neutrality, his security service, G2, had struck a deal to share intelligence with MI5 in 1939. This so-called Dublin link, agreed by G2's Colonel Dan Bryan and MI5's Guy Liddell, would do more to thwart the IRA than anything else during the war. De Valera had his own reasons for being seen to be dealing with the IRA. He regarded them as troublemakers who threatened to destabilize the neutrality of his republic. He knew that any IRA successes would harm his fragile relationship with Churchill.
De Valera's government realised that they're attempting to maintain a policy of strict neutrality. If the IRA does assist the Germans, this could be used by the British as an excuse for intervening in the Irish Free State.
And in December 1939 came an event that left de Valera in no doubt he had to act. 2 days before Christmas, a crack IRA team raided the Irish Army magazine fort in Dublin and stole over 1 million rounds of ammunition. 13 lorries were used to transport the 20 tons of shells away. Though almost all of the ammunition was recovered, the Germans heard about the raid and were suitably impressed. In response, de Valera and his government passed new emergency legislation, nominally to thwart any invasion by the Nazis, but in reality to crack down on the IRA. The Irish Army and Navy were mobilized and routinely simulated a German invasion of Ireland to prepare for the real thing. Bizarrely, the Irish Army, keen to distinguish themselves from the British, chose a uniform with a Germanic style. News was heavily censored, and G2, the Irish intelligence service, was given increased powers to suppress any anti-Irish activity. That included the IRA, and new laws gave police power to detain any of its members without trial.
For Irish neutrality to be tolerable to Britain, Dublin had to enforce the rule of law with an iron fist if necessary, which included draconian legislation and mass internment of suspects, and including the execution of a number of IRA activists.
In early 1940, Sean Russell sailed for America again to drum up support and raise more funds. He temporarily handed over the reins of the IRA to an altogether different personality, Stephen Hayes. A militant and a risk-taker, his behavior was compounded by his fondness for alcohol.
He is out of his depth very quickly, I think. He's always on the move. He's wanted by the Irish government. He's going from safe house to safe house. He's head of an organisation that's under intense pressure. He seems at this stage to have, dealt with very small numbers of people, not really had a complete picture of what was going on.
Stephen Hayes' first act was to intensify the Bloody S campaign. On the 6th of February 1940, explosions occurred simultaneously in London, Birmingham, and Manchester.
The plan was a very ambitious plan to cause a huge level of disruption in Britain, with bombs in public places, in places like cinemas, and in smaller targets like letterboxes, for example, and public lavatories, but also then bombs on railway lines and at power stations to effectively try and seriously disrupt life in Britain.
Hayes' Night of Terror raised eyebrows in Berlin. The Nazis were becoming concerned about the S-Plan's lack of focus. They wanted the IRA to concentrate on military targets in Northern Ireland, but Hayes and O'Donovan seemed more interested in plain terror. To get control of their trigger-happy friends, on the 9th of February, German intelligence, the Abwehr, sent another agent, Ernst Weber-Drohl, to meet the IRA. A former circus strongman, Drawn, landed in Killala Bay, County Sligo, on board submarine U-37. In his rubber dinghy, he brought a more powerful radio transmitter, $15,000 in cash, and a message from Germany requesting the IRA to stop bombing civilians.
What Abwehr would have preferred was that the IRA would have concentrated their activities in Northern Ireland against British military installations to generate broad public support in the nationalist communities north and south, and therefore create, in effect, a rebellion in British territory.
The message was heeded. The bombing stopped. But not before 300 bombs had been detonated. 96 people had been injured, 7 had died, and hundreds of IRA members interned. Reflecting in the 1960s, Seamus O'Donovan said the S-Plan campaign had brought nothing but harm to Ireland. Now the unpredictable Stephen Hayes knew that if he wanted Nazi support for his war, he would have to try a different approach. So he decided to offer the Germans something entirely new. He ordered one of his men, Stephen Held, and the Nazi spy, Oskar Faust, to deliver a plan he'd been working on. Faust and Held took the plan to Berlin, where it received an immediate response. That was why, on the 5th of May 1940, a lone German Heinkel was flying over the Irish Republic. And on board was a man known to the British intelligence as the Flying Spy. Hermann Gortz was a German intelligence officer who had spent 3 years in prison in Britain before the war on suspicion of spying. Now he had a new mission. Gortz's codename was Gilka. Gilka had studied the dossier sent by Stephen Hayes to Germany. It was nothing less than a plan for the Nazis to invade Northern Ireland with active IRA help. It was called Plan Kathleen.
Plan Kathleen talks about facilitating German landings in the southwest of Ireland and also in the north, along with a more general uprising by the IRA to seize key posts within Ireland and begin to try and overthrow both the Dublin and the Belfast governments.
Copies of Plan Kathleen are held in both Irish and British archives. And one section details reconnaissance plans for the Northern Irish city of Londonderry.
2. Coastal defences. Accurate sketches. A. To the entrance of Lough Foyle, protected by the coastal defence work. 4. Army. Where? A. Infantry. Where? What strength? What kind? Active. B. Reserve. Artillery. As to A. C. Motorised units. Where? What kind? Very important.
Gilka was to establish a secure link between Ireland and Germany and to work with the IRA to plan attacks on British military targets as preparation for the full-scale invasion of Northern Ireland. Plan Kathleen proposed the conquest of Northern Ireland by a simultaneous IRA insurgency and the landing of German forces. 50,000 Germans were to be dropped in the north, while over 30,000 IRA fighters were to be concentrated on the Irish border near Lough Erne. Together, they would sweep through Ulster and destroy all British forces. On the 5th of May 1940, the weather over Ireland was poor. According to his post-war statement, Hermann Gortz was supposed to land in Northern Ireland. In fact, he touched down about 80 kilometers to the south. During the descent, he lost his radio transmitter and the shovel he'd been given to bury his parachute and uniform. But to his credit, he marched for 5 days to an agreed rendezvous point, even asking the police for directions, still wearing his uniform. Seamus O'Donovan met him and spirited him away to a safe house. Herman Gortz, Stephen Hayes, Stephen Held, and Seamus O'Donovan met on the 17th of May 1940 to discuss Plan Kathleen, the Nazi invasion of Northern Ireland. On the surface, the plan had appeared to be sound, but it soon became apparent that things were not what they seemed. Hayes had exaggerated the IRA's strength. Instead of the promised 30,000 men, there would only be 5,000, and most of them would be unarmed. Worse still, the IRA had completely underestimated the strength of the opposition. Gortz later revealed that Plan Kathleen gave no thought to where or how the coast of Northern Ireland was fortified, how German troops were to be brought to Ireland, nor how control of the sea approaches was to be obtained. Plan Kathleen would have been a disaster.
I don't believe that Herman Gortz believed Plan Kathleen was a feasible option. It's quite clear that when he arrived, he was amused initially, horrified eventually. To a large extent, he saw them as dreamers, ineffective dreamers, who lacked strategic realism.
After the meeting, Gortz thought long and hard about whether or not the plan could be saved. 5 days later, while he was out gathering intelligence, the Irish police raided the safe house. Gortz's parachute, typewriter, maps, drawings, and a copy of Plan Kathleen itself were seized. The plan was blown, but Gortz slipped away. However, though Plan Kathleen was dead, the invasion of Northern Ireland was still very much alive. On the same day that Gortz had left Germany, Sean Russell had arrived from the USA. He was treated like a true friend and collaborator, staying in the best hotels and sampling the finest food and wine. He was then taken to a secret base.
Russell is given access to the Brandenburg camp where German forces are trained in sabotage, special explosives training. And he's also then introduced to various people in the Nazi hierarchy, including von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister.
Von Ribbentrop assigned Foreign Office Minister Edmund Wesenmeyer to oversee all joint IRA operations. Russell was given the details of Hitler's new plan to invade Ireland, called Operation Green. Operation Green was to be carried out in conjunction with Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of mainland Britain. It aimed to tie up British troops stationed in Northern Ireland who might have been sent to reinforce the southern English coast. It would also prevent Ireland being used as a refuge for evacuating troops, and would provide a staging post to the Luftwaffe forces to attack northern England. It is not known what role the IRA would have played in Operation Green, though Sean Russell had that information. On the 7th of August, he took it with him to Wilhelmshaven to board submarine U-65. It left Germany for Ireland the next day, but during the trip Russell fell ill and died, it is thought from a burst ulcer. He was buried at sea. In Ireland, Stephen Hayes took over as full-time Chief of Staff. Under his erratic leadership, the idea of invading Northern Ireland would live on. And southern England was already being softened up for invasion. The Battle of Britain was raging. If Hitler wanted to conquer Britain, he needed command of the skies. Throughout the summer of 1940, the struggle for air supremacy was played out above the English Channel in southeast England. But on the 15th of September, the Royal Air Force inflicted such damage on the Luftwaffe that Hitler postponed his invasion plans. Yet, the very next day, Irish intelligence intercepted a message to Churchill from 2 Irish Republicans.
So you think you'll win the war, you poor sap?
The IRA were not about to give up, and nor yet was Hitler. With Operation Sea Lion on hold, Hitler asked the Chief of the Navy and the head of the Luftwaffe for one last report on the likelihood of success of an invasion of Ireland. The Navy replied that any such invasion would be completely hopeless, believing there was a high probability that troops might be cut off and trapped. Operation Green was cancelled. And then, without warning, Ireland itself became a German target. On Easter Tuesday in April 1941, 180 Luftwaffe bombers attacked Belfast. Their target was the Harland and Wolff shipyard, a vital base for the Royal Navy. But the bombing was inaccurate. Over 1,000 died, and half the city's housing was destroyed. Even Ireland's Prime Minister, Eamon de Valera, was outraged and sent 13 fire tenders to the city to help. In the dark hours that followed, the whole of Ireland was united for the first time in decades. Maybe de Valera felt guilty, having discovered that the Luftwaffe used the unblacked-out Dublin to Belfast railway to navigate to their target. But then Dubliners too looked up into the night sky and heard the drone of approaching aircraft.
Unidentified warplanes dropped bombs on several occasions in different parts of neutral area. The bombs were subsequently proved, of course, to have come from Germany.
On the 31st of May, just after midnight, explosions were heard around the city. When morning broke, Dubliners awoke to 400 homeless, 90 injured, and 34 dead. Many still believe that it was a German reprisal bombing for coming to Belfast's aid. But it is more likely that a Luftwaffe squadron simply flew off course and dumped their bombs on the coastal city. Plan Kathleen had been ditched, Operation Green had been cancelled, and now the IRA's allies had bombed Dublin. The IRA was completely discredited. Worse still, Stephen Hayes' drinking habits had developed into an addiction.
There are increasing reports that Hayes has effectively become an alcoholic. And as a result, some of his active officers, particularly from Belfast, begin to distrust him and begin to suspect that all the setbacks the organisation is having are down to Hayes' leadership.
So the membership decided to take action.
Stephen Hayes is one of the most controversial figures in the history of the IRA. The IRA were a small marginal organisation under major pressure, and there's really not much else Hayes could have done as leader. But they suspect that he's a traitor, and during 1941 they actually kidnap him, court-martial him, interrogate him for a long period, and make him confess to having been a high-level spy on behalf of the Irish government.
Though no evidence has emerged that Hayes was an Irish government spy, the IRA sentenced him to death. But he escaped and went to the Irish police.
So he escapes, hands himself over to the police. His kidnappers are arrested, and while the IRA still regard Hayes as a traitor, in terms, again, of public opinion, the IRA just looked like a farcical organisation.
While in custody, the IRA revealed the full extent of Hayes' involvement in Plan Kathleen. He would serve just 5 years in prison. By now, Hermann Gortz was on the run. He made several escape attempts, including by a motorboat that sank off the southeast coast. He even went to the German embassy to beg them for help. Though they agreed to pass his messages to the Abwehr, they were reluctant to help him further and turned him away. On the 27th of November, he too was discovered and arrested.
Further pictures of the arrival of the first American expeditionary force to Britain, a troopship crowded with men from the great cities and plains of North America. Greetings to them all from the rank and file of this United Kingdom, united now as allies of those United States.
Any lingering hope of invading Northern Ireland was dashed when in January 1942, American troops were stationed in Europe for the first time. By May 1942, 37,000 GIs were based in Northern Ireland. But the IRA still had a point to prove. It had 300 volunteers left in its Belfast unit. Called Northern Command, it was by far the strongest wing of the organisation remaining. There were 26 arms caches hidden over the border in the Irish Republic. By August 1942, those arms were dug up and smuggled north to begin what the IRA called the Northern Campaign, a planned series of assaults on the British Army and police. But joint British and Irish intelligence operations thwarted their plans. All they managed were sporadic attacks on barracks and police stations, and the ambush and murder of several members of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. By the time the Allies were preparing for the D-Day landings, the IRA's organisation was shattered. In June 1944, its new Chief of Staff, Charlie Kerins, was arrested and 6 months later hanged. Irish Minister of Justice Gerald Boland boasted, "The IRA was dead, and I have killed it."
The legacy of this period of IRA history is limited. It's devoid of any achievement from an IRA perspective. To a large extent, it appears in retrospect as comedy or tragedy, depending on your point of view.
Even German spy Hermann Gortz wrote a series of articles in prison after the war about the challenge he faced in dealing with the IRA. He reflected that the Irish were very good at dying for their country, but not so good at fighting for it. But it's not just the IRA who can be labelled as incompetent at this time. Between 1933 and 1944, the Abwehr sent 10 agents to Ireland. All failed their missions.
Certainly the German attempt to land agents here is very often farcical and comical. Agents land, they go to the pubs, they get drunk, they more or less tell people why they're in Ireland and they ask to be put in contact with the IRA. And in some cases, they ask people for directions, and this is immediately reported to the police. And within, in some cases, the space of a few hours, these people are arrested.
The IRA's brief flirtation with the Nazis had come to nothing.
All over London, a fortress of freedom in the dark days, millions rejoice in final and complete victory after a war lasting nearly 6 years.
The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May 1945. German U-boats surfaced all around Ireland and surrendered to the British.
8 of them came to Londonderry in Northern Ireland, where they surrendered to the Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches.
But while all Europe celebrated, relations between Britain and the Irish Republic reached a new low. In Dublin, Prime Minister Eamon de Valera chose to visit the German embassy and send his condolences for the death of Hitler. He hadn't done the same for the recently deceased American president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. There were even rumors that the Irish tricolour flew at half-mast in some parts of Dublin. The victorious Winston Churchill attacked de Valera for allowing German shipping to pass through its waters unchecked.
This was indeed a deadly moment in our life. And if it had not been for the loyalty and friendship of Northern Ireland, we should have been forced to come to close quarters with Mr. de Valera or perish forever from the earth.
De Valera not only refused to apologize, he attacked the Allies over the trials of Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg.
The men who not long ago bestrode the continent of Europe and committed mass crime on a scale which staggers the imagination are today in the dock.
The Irish government refused to recognize the trials, comparing them to the British use of its legal system in Ireland before independence. Ireland also seemed to turn a blind eye to those with blood on their hands. It became a safe haven for several known Nazi collaborators. These included the Breton nationalist Celestine Lane, who had collaborated with the Nazis by hunting down resistance fighters in Brittany. Lane escaped to Ireland in 1947. He died there in 1983. Nicknamed the Himmler of the Balkans, the Croat collaborator, Andrija Artukovic, escaped to Ireland in 1947. He was implicated in the extermination of 4,000 Serbs and the construction of a system of Croatian concentration camps in September 1941. Otto Scarface Scorsini was a lieutenant colonel in the Waffen-SS. After fighting on the Eastern Front, he commanded a rescue mission that freed the deposed Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from captivity. In 1959, he was living in Ireland on a 200-acre farm in County Kildare. He later moved to Spain, where he trained mercenaries. Why was the Irish government prepared to harbour such men? It's a question that is still reluctant to answer today. Since the war, Eamon de Valera has often been characterised as a stern, unbending, devious, and even divisive Irish politician. But it's not entirely a fair portrait of him. In fact, de Valera had on occasion helped the British during the war. The German battleship Bismarck was about to attack the North Atlantic convoys in 1941 when it was spotted by a British flying boat that was based in the Irish Republic. That information was passed on to the Royal Navy, who intercepted and sank the Bismarck. And there was the crucial Dublin link between G2 and MI5 that undoubtedly led to the abandonment of Plan Kathleen and the thwarting of the IRA's activities. So what of the IRA's role? Perhaps the worst charge that can be levelled at them was that Churchill had to commit resources to find and stop the S-Plan terrorists. The emergency services and security services were too busy clearing up the IRA's mess when they should have been concentrating on the real enemy. And while there was no suggestion that the IRA was actively anti-Semitic, they had picked the most distasteful of friends. Suppose the IRA had won. Suppose Plan Kathleen or Operation Green had succeeded. The Nazis would indeed have had a presence in Ireland. Early in 1942, Adolf Eichmann, the man in charge of the logistics for the Holocaust, drew up a list detailing the number of Jews in Europe still to be exterminated. Ireland's 4,000 Jews were on that list. Had the IRA succeeded, there is a high probability that they would have all been killed. What would the legacy of the IRA have been then?
I think some of them probably thought they were being extremely clever and that they would get assistance from the Germans and not have to give anything in return. You could also argue that some of them were extremely naive. So I don't think most of them did understand the nature of the Nazi regime or its ambitions.
And where does that leave Sean Russell, a highly controversial figure whose obsession with a united Ireland blinded him to the Nazis' real intentions?
There was no doubt that most of the IRA were firm in their aspirations to achieve unification of Northern Ireland. Perhaps Sean Russell was the one individual who was most determined to lead, if necessary, a national revolution with German assistance.
Sean Russell's statue still stands in Dublin's Fairview Park. It's been vandalised twice, once decapitated by an anti-fascist group. Beirut, 1974. A passionate crowd of Arabs gathers for the funeral of one of their former leaders. Mohammed Amin Al-Husseini was a controversial figure throughout his life. A man whose decisions fundamentally affected the lives of his people. At just 26, he rose to claim the title Grand Mufti, the spiritual and political leader of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs. He is a character who, even now, polarizes opinion, particularly between Jews and Arabs. To many Jews, he is a man who collaborated with the Nazis and provides clear proof that all Arabs utterly despise them. He clearly supported the extermination of millions of Jews. In his own words, he said, "Kill the Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God, history, and religion." He even went as far as recruiting Muslims to form a special division of the dreaded SS.
The Mufti, as he himself acknowledged very clearly in his memoirs, was perfectly aware of the genocide. he was perfectly aware of the fact that the Nazis were perpetrating a genocide of European Jews.
But to Arabs, he was a man simply seeking to protect his people's rights to a territory that is now no longer theirs. In fact, to many, he was a prophet who foresaw the destruction of his homeland and only wanted to defend it. So what were his motives? How much did he really support Hitler and the Nazis' intentions towards the Jews? It's not simply a matter of history, as the Grand Mufti's actions and influence have had a significant impact on the Middle East of today. Mohammed al-Husseini's story is rooted in the period in the Middle East between the First and Second World Wars. Al-Husseini was born into a family of wealthy landowners in southern Palestine, near the holy city of Jerusalem, with a long and proud history. At the start of the 20th century, the whole region was largely under Muslim control, with around 400,000 Muslims and as few as 25,000 Jews. The land had been part of the massive Ottoman Empire for 400 years. But during the First World War, the empire was broken up and Palestine was controlled by the British.
The British occupied Palestine during the First World War. It didn't exist as a political entity under the Ottomans. But the British decided by the end of the First World War that they wanted to dismember the Ottoman Empire, and it was quite clear to them that Palestine was of tremendous strategic significance in terms of the need to protect Egypt and the Suez Canal from any potential aggressor.
During the First World War, the British had made explicit promises to the Arabs in the Middle East that they wanted a new era for the Arab people. They even sent out leaflets in Arabic, proclaiming that they fully supported the idea that Arabs should run their own countries. For al-Husseini and other politically motivated Palestinians, it meant that they were more than willing to help the British cause.
You have to remember that Haj Amin al-Husseini was not simply a bystander in the events of the end of the First World War. He worked with the British as an officer in the Sharifian Arab army in Palestine to recruit in the name of the cause of Arab national freedom fighting with the British. He was said to be very pro-British.
But this was a difficult time for those Arabs living in Palestine. They were witnessing more and more Jews settling in what they believed was their land. And even worse for the Palestinians, some of those Jews were hardline Zionists, Jews dedicated to the establishment of a solely Jewish nation. It was a situation that al-Husseini could not tolerate. Then, in November 1917, the British made a political move that has repercussions even today. They issued what became known as the Balfour Declaration. It stated that the British government now favored the establishment in Palestine of a homeland for the Jewish people. So in other words, the declaration supported the idea of a country for the Jews. There was no reference to Arabs at all.
There's no mention of the Palestinian Arabs in the Balfour Declaration. They're simply referred to as existing non-Jewish communities. The reason for that is that British Middle East specialists, Orientalists of the period, didn't think that there was an actual Arab population in Palestine. They simply saw them as a degenerate bunch of mixed races, the terminology that was used during this period. They didn't see that this was a cohesive community in any sense.
For al-Husseini, the Balfour Declaration was devastating news. And it was this that would cause him to set out on the path that would ultimately lead him to collaborate with the Nazis. He wasn't prepared to stand by and see his homeland simply given away by the British. He decided to fight. During the Muslim festival of Nebi Musa in Jerusalem, an anti-Jewish riot broke out in protest at the Balfour Declaration.
This is the first case of large-scale violence between the two communities. Al-Husseini, after the Nebi Musa riots, is accused, particularly by the Zionists, of orchestrating the entire thing. The commission that investigated the cause of the riots certainly believed that Al-Husseini had a part to play.
Afterwards, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison by a military court. But he avoided jail, as he'd already fled the country.
This figures as part of a larger narrative that he's a troublemaker, that the Palestinian Arabs would have been okay with Zionism if it wasn't for these extreme Palestinian Arab nationalist leaders like Al-Husseini, who throughout the mandate continually drive them towards extremism and violence against the Zionists.
Then in July 1920, the British made a move that would give Al-Husseini hope. They appointed their first High Commissioner to Palestine, Sir Herbert Samuel. It was an interesting choice.
He was a Liberal MP. He was the first Jewish member of the British cabinet. He was a high-profile politician. And during the First World War, he is the first person to submit a proposal to the British cabinet in support of the idea of the establishment of a Jewish state.
Despite his Zionist credentials, Samuel went out of his way to prove to the Arabs that although he was a Jew, above all else, he was fair. So he declared an amnesty for all Palestinian Arabs who had previously been sentenced by the British military. Still in exile at this point, Al-Husseini could now safely return to his homeland. Then came another event that changed Al-Husseini's life. His half-brother Kamal died suddenly. He was the Mufti of Jerusalem, the Palestinian Muslims' spiritual leader. His funeral was a lavish occasion attended by thousands. His death left a serious power vacuum in Jerusalem. It was a situation that the British had to resolve quickly. Samuel realized that if there was any chance of creating stability in the region, then the right person had to be appointed as the Mufti's successor. Samuel wasted no time in selecting Mohammed Amin al-Husseini to fill the role. To enhance the authority of their chosen man, the British suddenly bestowed a brand new title on him. Not only would he be the Mufti of Jerusalem, he would be the Grand Mufti of Palestine. That is the spiritual leader of not only Jerusalem's Muslims, but of all Muslims in Palestine. It was a job for which he was barely qualified.
The kind of education that would be relevant to the post of Mufti is, of course, religious education and theology. And he didn't achieve this. He started, but he interrupted to go to serve in the army in the First World War, and never resumed this education, so he has to be someone who very much learned in the Islamic theology, and that was certainly not the case with Amin al-Husseini. So this person, who was designated as the Mufti of Jerusalem and Grand Mufti of Palestine by the British authorities in 1921, was barely 26 years old, so very, very young person for the job.
He was such an unlikely choice that even his own people didn't think him fit for the job.
He was not even part of the 3 persons that were selected according to the normal procedure by the community of religious persons in Palestine for the job. So he was just picked by the British High Commissioner for Palestine, Herbert Samuel, who happens to be a Zionist himself, actually, who picked just Amin Husseini and designated him in this job that the British authorities had renamed Grand Mufti of Palestine in order to stress the fact that this was the highest spiritual authority on the territory of their mandate.
But despite his lack of qualifications, Al-Husseini took office on May the 8th, 1921. And from then onwards, his power and authority seems to keep on growing.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allah.
Within a year, he'd been elected president of the Supreme Muslim Council. At the age of just 26, he was now both the religious and political leader of the Arab community in Palestine, making him a hugely powerful player in the politics of the Middle East. At first, what looked like a high-risk appointment initially seemed to work. Al-Husseini worked hard to keep the peace. Towards the late 1920s, there were regular violent clashes between Palestinian Arabs and Jews. Jewish properties and even synagogues were attacked and destroyed. But the Grand Mufti was often seen attempting to restore order during the violence. Yet despite his attempts to keep the peace, there would soon be a dramatic turn of events that put him back on a collision course with the British. Those events occurred in Germany.
Sie wollte eine wahrhaftige Weltanschauungspartei sein. Und zweitens, sie wollte daher kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland.
By March 1933, support for Adolf Hitler was growing at an unstoppable speed. He'd risen to take total power over the country. He brought democracy to an end, and now, for the first time as dictator, he turned his attention to his driving and overall ambition, the destruction of the Jews.
Des Bekenntnisses, ich glaube, sondern der Schwur, ich kämpfe.
He began by imposing a national boycott of Jewish shops and department stores. Then on the night of May the 10th, 1933, an event unseen in Europe since the Middle Ages occurred as German students gathered in Berlin to burn books that were deemed to be Jewish. Later, Hitler introduced what became known as the Nuremberg Laws.
Unser Führer, im Retter und Schöpfer, Sieg Heil! Sieg Heil!
Deren Symbol Deutschland die Freiheit zurückgewonnen hat.
These severely restricted job opportunities for Jews, banned sexual relations between Jews and Germans, and in many cases, stripped Jews of their citizenship. Tens of thousands of Jews were forced to leave the country. One of their destinations was Palestine.
There can be no doubt that the major factor in providing the conditions for creating a Jewish state in Palestine has been the rise of Nazism to power, and concluded an agreement with the Zionist movement, which is called the Havara Agreement, that is a transfer agreement, to organize the immigration of German Jews to Palestine, which is the only destination to which German Jews were allowed to move part of their belongings in the form of German goods, German products, bought and exported to Palestine.
In 1933, the number of Jews in Palestine rose to 209,000.
Because of the explosion of Zionist immigration in the beginning of the 1930s, this leads to, as a result, an explosion of Palestinian Arab anger and resentment. This is the real challenge for Al-Husseini and other Arab leaders at the time. And as the Palestinian Arab population becomes more radicalised because of the situation in Palestine in the 1930s, by the middle of that decade, things really are clearly out of the control of the Palestinian Arab elite.
By 1937, the number of Jews had risen again. The figure now stood at 396,000. But rather than the Mufti blaming the Germans for this influx, the German consul general in Palestine, Heinrich Wolf, informed the Führer that Palestinian Muslims were making sympathetic noises towards the new Nazi regime. New Jewish communities with extensive building programs were continuing to populate Palestine. But news for the Arab population was about to get even worse. In London, the British government rejected a demand made by Al-Husseini and other Arab leaders for an official council, designed to give them more control over their homeland. It was a bitter blow to their hopes of establishing a group to represent the views of the wider Palestinian Arab population.
The members of Parliament who rejected the proposal of a legislative council did so because of the fear that this would undermine Britain's commitment to Zionism. And there was widespread belief in the Houses of Parliament that Zionism was per se a good thing. The members of Parliament continued to believe the old narrative that European migration in the shape of Zionist migration would raise the living standards of the Palestinian Arabs, that the Zionists were civilizing the backward Orient. And that was the spark that led to the uprising.
Arab leaders in Palestine now called for a general strike. It meant a total refusal to pay taxes and a countrywide strike of all Arab workers and businesses. The Arab leadership quickly organized themselves to coordinate further political demonstrations and strikes. They formed the Arab Higher Committee. Its role, to make demands of the British government during the unrest. The head of this new organization was the Grand Mufti himself. The Grand Mufti declared that the strike would continue until all Jewish immigration into Palestine was stopped. During the summer of 1936, the strikes brought the region to a standstill. Shops and businesses were forced to close throughout Palestine. It immediately caused widespread unrest. As violence broke out, the country's infrastructure was smashed. The transport network was sabotaged. British troops were sent in to quell the rising violence. They targeted Arab gangs who were attacking Jewish communities indiscriminately. It was the start of a 3-year-long bloodbath that became known as the Arab Revolt. During that first summer, thousands of acres of Jewish farmland were destroyed. The British tried in vain to keep the peace. But by October of 1936, with the revolt already 6 months old, an estimated 1,300 people had been killed. The British set up and dispatched a committee to the region, known as the Peel Commission. Its task was to investigate the reasons for the clashes and to come up with solutions. But their recommendations would only make things worse for the Palestinians.
The Peel Commission came to a conclusion, including a recommendation which were very clearly tailored according to the wishes of the Zionist movement, that is the partition of Palestine. That was the first clear pronouncement from a British source official source on the issue of partition. And of course, that was vehemently rejected by the Palestinians, including the Mufti.
The new map gave the Jews their own land in the north, with the British retaining the area around Jerusalem. Fearing that their country was about to be carved up, violence again flared in the region. In 1937, Al-Husseini was deposed as president of the Supreme Muslim Council by the British authorities, and the Arab Higher Committee was declared illegal.
Unrest in Palestine. Suspecting that the Higher Committee had incited Arab leaders to start a holy war against the British government, police swooped on the secret headquarters of assassins and rebels. Many arrests were made. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, head of the Muslim Supreme Council, was deprived of office. The frontiers are guarded with special vigilance. All roads leading to Jerusalem patrolled. The British government is determined to stamp out terrorism.
Warrants for the arrest of the leaders of the committee were issued, but the Grand Mufti escaped to the Haram, the holy area of the city, where he was untouchable by the British. After 3 months in hiding, he fled the country and began a tortuous journey that would end at the very heart of the Nazi regime.
He's staying in Syria, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. Foremost in the Palestine-Arab trouble, he eluded the British and escaped from the Mosque of Omar.
Now in exile in Syria, he continued to direct the war against the British. But British troop numbers were too small to crush the revolt. Strikes, sabotage, assassinations, and the guerrilla warfare went on without let-up. The British military presence was small in comparison to the Palestinian Arab forces. They were being overrun. But then Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain found a new way of freeing up extra troops. He signed a deal with Hitler, giving him part of Czechoslovakia. Allegedly, this made Europe safe from the threat of war. With more than 20,000 troops, 3 RAF squadrons and 4,000 police, the British now began to squeeze the life out of the Arab Revolt. Villagers accused of sheltering Arab rebels had their houses blown up. Those Arabs suspected of taking part in the fighting were killed or beaten. Thousands of men were rounded up and imprisoned in detention camps without trial. At least 112 Arabs were hanged for taking part in the rebellion. According to official figures, by the spring of 1939, when the revolt effectively ended, the British had killed more than 2,000 Arabs.
The British crushed the Arab uprising, which was the most significant challenge to British imperial authority in the 1930s, and a testament to the Palestinian national movement at that time. But because of the extent of British military suppression of that revolt and the brutality of that suppression against the Palestinian Arab people, you end up with a floundering Palestinian Arab movement after the revolt and going into the Second World War. And the movements of Al-Husseini after the revolt are really a testament to that floundering of the Palestinian Arab national movement that's completely lost after the revolt and after it being crushed by the British.
But then in May 1939, the British government did an amazing U-turn. With Europe now back on the verge of war, they realized that they simply did not have enough men and machines to defend the Suez Canal and the precious oil fields of Iraq and Persia, as well as fighting Arab rebels in Palestine. Arab public opinion in the Middle East needed to be appeased. So they produced a paper calling for strict limits on Jewish immigration and the creation of an independent Palestine by 1949. Here was an offer that seemed to give Al-Husseini and his freedom fighters everything they'd asked for.
The 1939 White Paper was seen by many Palestinian nationalists, including some radical nationalists, as a real achievement of the fight that has been waged by the Palestinians ever since the start of the revolt, the Great Revolt in 1936.
It was a sharp curtailment of Jewish immigration that was going to be limited to 75,000 over the following 5 years. And also a commitment that in 10 years' time, there would be an independent Palestinian state.
They really saw in the White Paper the outcome of these years of struggle and the very high cost that they had to pay for that in lives and in repression and all that.
This was a real chance for the Mufti to get what he wanted. Such was his hatred of the British that he dismissed their efforts to attempt to win him over. He rejected the White Paper's recommendations, and he went much further. He called for an end to the British mandate in Palestine. He wanted the British out and the creation of a single Arab state. The forces that propel him to collaborate with the Nazis were now inevitable.
He had his own selfish personal ambitions above any considerations of the real interest of his people and the movement. I'm saying that because, again, many nationalist leaders of the Palestinians considered that the White Paper should have been accepted, and at the time were in favor of expressing approval of the White Paper and seeing in the White Paper a victory of the movement.
Now the Grand Mufti was effectively at war with the British, and he desperately needed allies. He gave a clear indication of who they might be. Al-Husseini was quoted as saying, "What do we care who backs us, or who we align ourselves with, as long as it helps us to attain our goals? We have a common enemy, the British and the Jews."
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
As the war began in Europe, Al-Husseini's deteriorating relationship with the Syrian authorities forced him to move on from his base in Damascus. This time, he made for the Kingdom of Iraq. In Baghdad, he continued his political agitating, and in 1941 was involved in an anti-British revolt. From his base in Iraq, he issued a fatwa for a holy war against Britain. But just days later, British troops invaded Iraq, and Al-Husseini was forced to move on yet again. This time, he made for fascist Italy, where he met with the country's dictator, Benito Mussolini. Whilst in Italy, the Grand Mufti prepared a declaration confirming his support for the Axis powers. He was officially declaring his allegiance to the Nazis and their supporters. Within days, it had been sent to the German embassy in Rome. And on the 6th of November 1941, the Grand Mufti entered Berlin for the first time to meet directly with German officials.
When the Mufti arrived in 1941 in Berlin, he was, of course, greeted by many Nazi officials, especially those who were in touch already with him and in charge of operations in the Middle East, the political and strategic operations of Nazi Germany in the Middle East. But he, of course, requested to meet the Führer. He believed that his own stature meant that he had to meet in person the chief of the Nazis. The Hitler was not very much enthused about this idea of meeting a person like that.
Although reluctant to meet in person with the Grand Mufti, Hitler was told by his advisors that it might be useful in convincing him to help Germany win over the Arab population of the Middle East. So on November the 28th, 1941, the Grand Mufti was ushered into a private room in Hitler's chancellery. Surrounded by Nazi dignitaries, he finally met the Führer. It wasn't a long meeting, but Al-Husseini appeared to get what he so desperately wanted.
Hitler was saying, give me some time, let us develop our military strategy, and when we'll be in the military position of dominating this part of the world, we will fulfill your desires of independence. But until then, I have political considerations, so you have to, accept my pledge, and that's it. And this was the only meeting Hitler ever gave the Mufti.
The deal was pretty clear. While the Nazis stopped short of actually recognizing an independent Palestine, Hitler was planning to deal with the Jews who'd settled in the country. And so began the Mufti's 4-year-long relationship with the Nazis. Throughout his time in Germany during the Second World War, Al-Husseini appeared to enjoy a close working relationship with some of the highest-ranking Nazis. In the Grand Mufti's memoirs, published in 1999, he freely discusses his close relationship with SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, the man who was the architect of the extermination of the Jews. According to his own account, he often met Himmler for tea. On one such occasion, the Grand Mufti had his photograph taken with him. It contains a signed dedication from Himmler to His Eminence the Grand Mufti, a memento. This wasn't the only exchange of gifts between Mohammed al-Husseini and the Nazi leaders. The Grand Mufti even went to such lengths as having a Persian rug specially made for the Führer himself. From his bureau in Berlin, he also planned a series of radio broadcasts to the Middle East. His first came in December 1941, and he continued to broadcast throughout the entire war. But then his involvement with the Nazis became deeper and darker. In 1942, Himmler's deputy Reinhard Heydrich convened a meeting of Nazi officials who met here at Wannsee, near Berlin. At the meeting, the Nazi hierarchy launched their project to deal with the millions of Jews in Europe. They rubber-stamped the plan which became known as the final solution to the Jewish problem. It meant the systematic rounding up of Jews and their extermination in death camps all over Europe. So what did the Grand Mufti really know of the Nazis' plans?
Mufti, as he himself acknowledged very clearly in his memoirs, was perfectly aware of the genocide. He was perfectly aware of the fact that the Nazis were perpetrating a genocide of European Jews. He tells himself in his memoir the story of his encounter in July 1943 with Himmler, during which Himmler told him that Germany was in the process of exterminating the Jews and had already killed 3 million of them. He himself recognizes that he knew. He was informed about that, at least in July 1943.
Whilst there is no evidence of the Grand Mufti actively assisting Hitler's plans, he certainly did help the Nazi war effort.
Über den Bergen von Bosnien. Deutsche Kampfflugzeuge zerstören die Schlupfwinkel kommunistischer Banditen.
As the Second World War progressed and Germany began to suffer defeats, their troops became more and more stretched. One area of conflict where there was a desperate need for military support was the Balkans. There, the communist partisans were growing in strength. The Germans needed more resources urgently, especially soldiers. One possible solution was the drafting of Bosnian Muslims. But they had been strictly forbidden by Muslim leaders from collaborating with the Nazis. So the German authorities turned to their trusted Muslim voice, the Grand Mufti, to exert pressure on the power brokers in the region. In the spring of 1943, the Mufti successfully convinced Bosnian Muslims to ignore the clerics. By doing so, he played a major role in establishing a new unit of the SS, the most feared and fanatical part of the German armed forces. It was the SS that was responsible for some of the most brutal and horrendous crimes perpetrated in the whole of the war. The unit that the Grand Mufti helped set up became known as the 13th Waffen SS Mountain Division and consisted almost entirely of Muslims. However, again, there is no evidence that this unit was actively involved in any anti-Jewish atrocities. But the Grand Mufti went further. He wrote letters to European leaders urging them not only to stop sending their Jewish citizens to Palestine, but to actively redirect them to Poland.
He knew that there were concentration camps. That was publicly known. And therefore, he was advocating that the Jews be sent to concentration camps instead of being sent to Palestine. So we can see here the qualitative difference between a Palestinian national leader who would say to any governments, don't send your Jews to Palestine. That's one thing. And a Palestinian leader would say, don't send your Jews to Palestine, but send them to Poland in concentration camps. So here you move from what could be seen as a legitimate national position or nationalist position into a criminal statement. And indeed, the Mufti had a very abject role during those years. There's no way, therefore, one can excuse him for that or find any justification.
The Mufti's justification was probably to get help in his efforts to attack the British in his homeland. He asked the Nazi hierarchy to organize sabotage missions against the Allies in the Middle East. His requests met with some success. Teams of saboteurs were parachuted into Iraq, Jordan, and Palestine, where they targeted Allied facilities such as telephone lines, pipelines, bridges, and railways. But when he asked the German Air Command to carry out bigger raids along the Palestine coast and on Tel Aviv, he was less successful. Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, rejected the plan, saying he simply didn't have enough men and machines to divert from Europe. But despite being let down by the Nazi hierarchy that he had come to trust, he continued to throw his support behind them. On March 1st, 1944, during one of his many broadcasts, he said, "Arabs, rise as one man and fight for your sacred rights. Kill the Jews wherever you find them. This pleases God, history, and religion. This saves your honor. God is with you."
We are not here dealing with, let's say, a kind of average nationalist leader fighting for the independence of his nation, for the liberation of his nation, and willing to make some tactical compromises or alliances for that purpose. No, we are dealing with somebody who believed in a real convergence between himself, what he represented, and the Nazis on the terrain of anti-Semitism.
And the drive goes on. Hanover is captured, and civilians wave white handkerchiefs and line the streets to watch a victorious army rumble through to the east.
As the Second World War drew to its conclusion in the spring of 1945, it became clear to the Grand Mufti that defeat for Hitler and the Nazis was only a matter of time. Al-Husseini had escaped capture before, and he was about to do it again.
This is the defeat of Germany. Facing Air Chief Marshal Tedder and Marshal Zhukov is a conquered German general. Keitel signs the surrender.
Just a day after Germany surrendered to the Allies, Al-Husseini boarded a plane for neutral Switzerland. But he was denied political asylum and moved swiftly on to Paris. A year later, in the spring of 1946, the Grand Mufti's actions during the war were examined at the Nuremberg trials.
The Mufti was not indicted as part of the Nuremberg tribunal and all that. There wasn't enough evidence accumulated against him, despite the efforts of course, the Zionist movement. The fact is that, of course, Husseini did everything I mentioned in terms of propaganda, contribution to the propaganda. He was a close collaborator of the Nazis. But he was not himself directly involved in war crimes.
Now the Grand Mufti beat one more hasty retreat, this time to the Egyptian capital Cairo, where he was finally given political asylum and a hero's welcome. So what is one to make of the Grand Mufti of Palestine? To some, he was simply a committed nationalist religious leader, one who was driven into the arms of the Germans by an unsympathetic British government, which repeatedly let him and his people down. They see him as a man faced with losing everything he'd promised his people he would protect. A man who would go to any lengths to see his Palestine remain solely in the hands of the Arabs.
Some people in the Arab world had tried to, if not justify, at least to find attenuating circumstances for the Mufti's collaboration with Nazism. through the famous saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
But to others, his relationship with the Nazis is damning.
When you know about the nature of the force with which you are allying, and this force is committing such a huge crime against humanity, then this enemy of my enemy does not really hold water as an argument. The abjection, the abomination of collaborating with such a regime is clear.
Mohammed Amin Al-Husseini never returned to Jerusalem after his escape in 1937. The Grand Mufti of Palestine eventually died in exile in Beirut in 1974, aged 79. His place as leader of the Palestinian Arabs was eventually taken by a relative, Mohammed Yasser Abdul Rahman Al-Husseini, better known as Yasser Arafat. In August 2002, Arafat gave an interview in which he referred to Mohammed al-Husseini as a symbol of Palestinian Arab resistance. He called him simply a hero. But it's not a view shared by many.